the way Bitcoin came about seems like a story that's virtually impossible to believe. You couldn't make it up, right? So this unknown engineer, Satoshi, anonymous, came up with this idea that no one else had ever had, implemented it online, anonymized it, and then vanished essentially without a trace. I mean, how much do people know about him? Are we sure he's who invented it? And what the hell was he up to? And why did this happen? And why should an outsider believe any of this? Because it does seem like the plot of a bad science fiction novel.
I will confess that I did used to think about this in similar terms, but I'll say this. You use the wheel every day, but you don't know who invented the wheel. And we use a lot of things every day that you don't use them because you trust the guy who made them. You use them because they have a proven track record. You've spent your life seeing wheels working, and so you're willing to trust a wheel next time you get into a car. So I think, that's ultimately what... in a sense, it's kind of bad press for Bitcoin, but like a lot of things about Bitcoin, it actually ends up being illustrating its strength. Yes, this thing has a story that, a PR person would tell you, just don't bother, start doing something else with your life rather than try and sell this thing. And it doesn't need anybody to sell it. That's kind of the point. It doesn't have a story. It doesn't have a PR person. And the fact that it has this kind of ugly story where this person just came in and then disappeared, and who knows what happened? Nobody really knows. Maybe he died. Maybe he has other things to keep him busy. Maybe he's incapacitated in some way. But ultimately, it doesn't matter, because even if he were to come back today, he has no ability to control the network any more than you and I can control it. He can control the code that he runs on his computer. But at this point, the project has worked 10 years without him. So there's no reason why anybody in Bitcoin is going to defer to his judgment if he were to come back. But besides this, I think the key point is that it works regardless of whether this person is part of it or not.
Okay, so fair enough. I understand that. So advantages of Bitcoin, you contrast that. Oh yeah, a couple of questions. Advantages of Bitcoin over fiat currency, and that needs to be defined, fiat currency. And then I'm also curious, as an outsider, you're an advocate, I suppose, of the Austrian School of Economics, and there are a variety of economic schools, and maybe you could briefly, for everyone who's listening, outline the competing schools and what the different propositions are and why there are competing schools and why you chose the Austrian school.
Okay, I'll say this. I think the main split is between the Austrians and everybody else, as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to the main most important questions, because the Austrians come at the question from a different starting point, which is that value is subjective. Economic value is subjective, and that then leads to a whole different intellectual path with different methodologies and different conclusions from what you get from essentially everybody within the mainstream. And when I say the mainstream, that includes neoclassical economists, Chicago school economists to some extent, Keynesian economists, and all other different flavors, and even Marxist economists. Because on the main and big questions, I think the Austrians stand on a completely different ground, which is value is subjective. So therefore, economic calculation is something that is done at an individual level, and it is something that cannot be done objectively by a centralized authority, which is the kind of physics envy that has plagued mainstream economics throughout the 20th century. So this leads to a difference in methodology, leads to a difference in conclusions, which is once you understand that value is subjective, you realize the best person who's able to achieve the important values that matter to them is the person themselves. And so you are more likely to be sympathetic to ideas that give individuals more autonomy over their own life in economic terms. Whereas from the other schools, it's a question of what is the optimum policy and what kind of policy should government be using. So the questioning of the entire premise of the need for economic policy and for the need of economic management by the government is one important difference.
So if you're working within the parameters of the Austrian economic school, does that tilt you? So that tilts you more towards appreciation of non-centrally controlled distributed networks and the emphasis on the individual actor. That's
Yes, and to the mainstream economists, this is irredeemably ideological and unscientific. But to the Austrians,
what's the rationale for that though? Because it seems precisely the opposite. I mean, because it seems to me that that's more grounded in a kind of humility. There's no way of determining once and for all what the best thing is for the most people. So what we should try to do is establish institutions that distribute decision making in as an uncontrolled manner as possible, I suppose. So that's like in some sense, is that a radically free market approach that is applied to all sorts of institutions? And the fundamental issue there is the decentralization of decision-making power.
Absolutely. And this is what, from the mainstream perspective appears to be ridiculous, because in their mind, the job of the economist is to figure out how the government can fix the economy, get rid of unemployment and eliminate wage disparities and get rid of inequality and all these other buzzwords that appear to be, profound economic scientific thinking, when really is just politics masquerading as science. How would a mainstream economist react to that kind of statement if you were playing devil's advocate to help me understand how they would criticize what they'd say is what they'd say is the Austrian school made important contributions up until the First World War to marginal analysis, but then the field advanced mathematically, with the improvement in mathematical techniques that happened around the world, and with the advancement of computers. There became so much more room for the application of mathematical and quantitative methods into economics, and the Austrian school failed to keep up with that, and so they're still stuck in the past, writing essays, shouting at the clouds, not making much sense, whereas the mainstream has moved on to this scientific management, which is, once you scratch under the surface, you realize there's very few differences between modern macroeconomists' scientific management and erstwhile socialist economists and Soviet economists and their conception of central planning. It's, in fact, one interesting anecdote. Paul Samuelson literally wrote the textbook on economics in post-World War II America and the world. And his Principles of Economics textbook, which first came out in the 40s or 50s, I don't remember when was the first edition, and it continued to come out until his death about 10, 15 years ago. Up until the 1989 edition, the book had continuously, when discussing the Soviet economy, the book had continuously said the Soviet economy will likely outperform the US economy, and it will overtake the US economy within the next few years. And there's a paper that is done that goes through all of these different editions, and as Samuelson continues to move the goalposts. They were supposed to overtake the US in 68, but then by the 65 edition, they're supposed to take the US in 75 now, and then new edition comes along. And I don't remember the exact dates, but they kept on kicking the can down the road while continuously, not challenging the essential idea, which is that central planning of the economy works, and the Soviet Union is going to do a better job than the US. But their defense against central planning of the economy is that it flies in the face of democratic control of society, and we wouldn't want to infringe on people's freedom. So for mainstream economists, the problem with Soviet economic planning was that it necessitated, breaking a few eggs and putting a few million people in gulags. And that's why we don't want it, but it would work and it would give us more GDP. And so this continued to be published in Paul Samuelson's textbooks up until 1989 or 1990 or something like that. Students were studying this in class as the Soviet Union was collapsing. And of course, this is fiat academia, fiat world. The next year, they just take that section out, and they continue to print the textbooks that continue to teach kids in universities around the world today that, this is how economics works. And economics is about central planning.
Were you trained at Columbia as a classical economist?
Yeah, I took the foundational course for economics at Columbia, yeah. My PhD was in sustainable development. It wasn't entirely economics, but we took the foundational courses of economics, basically.
So why did you become a deviant from that, let's say? What was your intellectual journey? And I'm very curious about that.
My undergraduate background was in mechanical engineering, of all things. And in my PhD, it was in sustainable development, and we were supposed to study issues of, energy and society and economics, and approach it from a multidisciplinary perspective. So my engineering background and then my new knowledge in economics gave me that kind of what Hayek calls the fatal conceit of, I'm just going to pick a topic in energy economics, in energy and engineering economics, and study it with the big brains of a Columbia PhD, and then figure out what needs to be done, basically. Mm-hmm. And then you can maintain these illusions until you actually start digging into the spreadsheets, and then you start trying to actually mathematically model the complex world outside and put it on a spreadsheet on your computer, and then you start realizing just how absurd these things are.
Yeah, well, you'd think if you could do that, then you could put the stock market on a spreadsheet and run your economic wizardry and gather all the money in the world with your capability to model the economic system and predict. And yet no one can do that.